Moscow's elusive shadow fleet tankers.
Battle against Russia's shadow fleet.
Government sources say they will not import oil from Russia using sanctioned ships.
Although Chinese President Xi Jinping has been known to wish to increase his influence in a world thrown off by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, his most recent action is probably going to annoy Russian President Vladimir Putin. Beijing has approved of a restriction on U.S.-sanctioned Russian oil ships at Shandong's eastern ports. The action blocks one of the most crucial gates for Russia's so-called shadow fleet, vessels meant to evade Western restrictions and ship oil. Actually, especially following the beginning of the Ukraine war, China and Russia seem to have moved strategically closer. Dependent more on China, the biggest crude oil importer in the world, the Kremlin sought fresh markets for its supplies of energy in face of Western sanctions. Beijing has so benefited economically from cutting off discounted crude oil from Russia. Although the two sides have lately adopted the rhetoric of friendship without borders, more and more people are inquiring about the degree of strength of this friendship. The most recent restriction by the Shandong Port Group exposes Beijing's strategy to boost its sway over Moscow, therefore undermining the impression that China is embracing Russia. Putin's oil exports, which have been mostly cut off from Europe and turned to Asia, may suffer even if the port decision does not lower the capacity of the shadow fleet to zero under Washington's sanctions. Particularly, the massive refineries in Shandong province were a vital import point maintaining Russia's crude oil income alive. The port organization has lately declared, though, that it will not let tankers blacklisted by the U.S. to anchor. Examining Beijing-Moscow relations through the prism of history and strategy also helps us to appreciate this occurrence. Early in the 20th century, the two neighbors had periods of communism and Soviet aid. Nevertheless, there were also times of ideological conflict and tensions over significant boundary issues that resulted in violent combat. As Russia started to lose its markets to Europe in the post-Soviet era, it opened the path for collaboration with China. China then wanted stronger connections with Russia both to increase its economic interests and to have a geopolitical partner against the United States. The two nations have displayed UN Security Council unity quite regularly. Still, Beijing has another trump card since Russia, caught under Western sanctions, is progressively depending more on China. Russia has grown yuan and ruble-based trade with China today, been compelled to rely on Chinese banks and markets, and have to accept Beijing's economic preconditions without access to dollars and euros. Consequently, trade cooperation with China and foreign exchange dynamics have become rather important for the survival of the Russian economy. The Shandong port ban so tells Moscow that a critical door could close at any moment. The U.S. developed a secondary sanctions system for nations like Iran and Venezuela, and Beijing obviously has no problems about subtly supporting Washington on this matter. Now, Russia is being subjected to this system. Though the Chinese Foreign Ministry has not been very transparent about these developments, Beijing's stance that we are against unilateral U.S. sanctions, but we will adapt when necessary to suit our interests, is reflected in the port policy of de facto boycotting Russian tankers. Beijing is not only winking at Russian enterprises close to it, saying, "Do not cooperate with the illegal tankers of the Shadow Fleet," but also putting a highly sensitive portion of the Russian economy into her own hands with this move. Furthermore, this action demonstrates that China can eventually control Russia as a possible provider of natural resources or granary. Russia's condition is somewhat paradoxical. On the one hand, it is trying to maintain the economy liquid to mobilize society and is paying enormous military expenditure to keep the war raging in Ukraine. Conversely, it seeks to offset the loss of foreign trade brought about by China's break with the West. Russia is thus experiencing labor shortages and inflation, as well as central banks' search for more paths into the worldwide financial system with digital ruble programs. Moscow is being pushed in the path Beijing suggests by all this. The rising presence of Chinese banks in the Russian market refutes Russia's assertion that we will preserve our economic independence. Over Russia's crude oil and natural gas, China has developed notable negotiating leverage. Russia's claims, "China is our friend," notwithstanding all the rhetoric, show from Shandong port that Beijing is acting far more pragmatically. The term unlimited friendship is no comfort for Moscow, since Beijing is now able to cut Russia's lifeline at will and reopen it at will. Russia's isolation from foreign markets opens China's path to apply low-cost loans or high-interest deals on it. Thus, others contend that with these restrictions, Beijing can rein Russia in and, if necessary, bring it to its knees. Beijing does not want Russia to experience an economic collapse. So, the Xi Jinping government does not want to risk compromising itself by seeming to overlook Western sanctions completely. Beijing wants to benefit from the fact that we got discounted oil from Russia and simultaneously convey a subdued message indicating, "I am not severing ties with the West." Examining the concept that China is Russia's biggest threat, the largest risk facing Russia should the dependency relationship reverse is that it will have to submit to Beijing. Once eclipsed by the Soviet Union, China's great economic might now seems to enable her to control Russia as it suits. Aware of this, Putin is trying to present Russia as an unshakable superpower, menacing the West with nuclear weapons, but in reality, he is desperately poor. Spending has surged, and Chinese corporations are filling in for Western businesses, driven out by sanctions as Ukraine suffers a protracted conflict. Still, China is making money. The share of the yuan in the Russian market is swiftly rising, and Chinese banks and digital payment systems are having increasing impact. Not too far off, Beijing's backyard might be the Russian economy. The issue is Moscow on Beijing's side or Beijing on Moscow's has a simple solution provided by this image. The Shandong port decision teaches Beijing how to abruptly stop and announce, "I do not accept these ships," therefore pushing Russia into a corner and rendering it more dependent on Beijing. The Kremlin's alternatives are few even if its public response is different. Finding alternative ports is difficult. Transportation expenses are growing. Putin's oil trump card has lost appeal given Russia's diminishing confidence in world commodities markets. If China is not totally supportive, the oil argument Russia employs as a blackmail card against the Western world and international organizations loses much of its relevance. This evolution can also lead to a shake in the global energy industry. This is so because the agenda items include: if Russian oil becomes increasingly isolated, will prices rise, or will Chinese refineries turn to other sources? Most analysts also recall China uses the African market and can get crude oil from nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia. It is thus not dependent on Russia. Rather, it just works with Russia as much as it can. Beijing has lately sent many more goods from Iran. Therefore, the Shandong ban supports Beijing's flexible policy. By reversing the ships blacklisted by the United States, Beijing partly reassures the West and at the same time threatens Moscow. Do not push my limits, I have options. Another instance of diplomatic double game is the comment of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. We oppose unilateral U.S. sanctions, but the port of Shandong may have made a local decision. For Russia, things probably grow even more convoluted. Designed to get around Western sanctions, the Shadow Fleet is a dense network of tankers. Whether transferred from OPEC nations or of unknown origin, its capacity to sell crude oil to the world depends on several ports turning a blind eye. Now, even if just on paper, Russia has suffered a loss with one of China's largest port operators out from the picture. The Shadow Fleet will be short of ports, so tankers will have to modify their intended path, so losing time and money. Russia is also having logistical issues in the Baltic and Black Seas under the present geopolitical tensions. Countries in the Baltic Sea are refusing to help Russian tankers because of EU sanctions. Similar door closures across Asia so undermine Putin's "there is no one we do not need" rhetoric. Putin's strategic foundations are clearly flimsy, as Russia, on the one hand, is involved in a territorial conflict with nations like Poland and Ukraine, and on the other hand, is being kept on alert by a massive player like China, which can be left gasping for oxygen when needed. The deeper ramifications of the problem between Russia and China also address the question, on which front is Moscow truly under more threat? Although Russia's biggest threat may come from the United States or NATO, some contend from an economic standpoint China might potentially become a major concern over time. This is so because Moscow cannot fight Beijing as much as it would like to at the end of the day, and Russia has a rather smaller population and a poorer industrial infrastructure than its neighbor. Rising Chinese investments in Siberia, Beijing's control of energy lines and logistics, and Beijing's direction of projects on digital currencies could compromise Russian state sovereignty. A sizable Shanghai port or shipyard today may be Russia's main export gateway. However, should Beijing announce, "I have closed this door," the room for maneuverability of the Russian economy is severely constrained. Russia's apparently massive crude oil Trump hand depends on China in truth. The most clear illustration of this reliance is the Shandong port ban. China, on the other hand, can close the gates if needed or open them for Russia depending on need. Such flux makes the Xi Jinping government the most pragmatic diplomacy in the world. It benefits from both sides by keeping trade contacts with the West to some degree on one hand and strategic partners with Russia on the other. Beijing has even extended an olive branch to the United States by saying, "I have closed the door to these ships," while Washington's blacklisting of Shadow Fleet tankers shows that the Xi government is acting to safeguard its multifarious interests, so allaying fears that China and Russia are getting closer, that together they will rival the US. Russia is bound to China as it is pressed in Ukraine, but this implies bending to every action of Beijing. Additionally, requiring Beijing's consent is trying to sell oil using its shadow fleet. Stated differently, Russia has become unable to organize even its illegal shipments on the world oil market without China. All of this research clarifies why Putin could find great damage from China's shadow fleet action. When the West limited his oil exports, the Kremlin leader turned to Asia after trying to defy the West with nuclear weapons and oil leverage. At the center of Asia, China is deftly exploiting these exports for its own benefit. If Russia presses too hard, it can close ports like Shandong and declare, "I do not want your ships." Moscow's reliance on Beijing increases under this pressure, therefore compromising Russia's autonomy over time. Putin often meets with Xi and stresses strategic partnership against the West, to be sure, but in practice the bilateral relationship is one of whoever holds the trump card, the other will follow. Xi Jinping owns the trump cards right now. Moscow is becoming more tightly bound to Beijing's cord by Russia's retreat from Europe and rising military investment in Ukraine. Although Xi might not impose a complete economic embargo against Russia, he can, on any one day, highlight Putin's shortcomings by using Shandong. Beijing would thus be positioned as a state posing as an ally, although behind the scenes it is compelling Russia to its will. Should Russia suffer in the Asian market going forward, the Putin government might resort to more drastic measures such deploying nuclear weapons or creating new resources via Wagner-like operations in Africa. China worries about Russia's radicalizing, though, as well. A highly radicalized Russia would raise the possibility of world nuclear war, which would be quite detrimental for Beijing. The Xi government is thus following a subdued policy of, let us not drive Putin to total collapse, but let us rein him in when necessary. This complex program now includes a new component, the Shandong port ban. Beijing declares, we oppose unilateral U.S. sanctions, but concurrently it is practically prohibiting U.S.-sanctioned ships from passing the port. This paradox communicates the idea that the Chinese state does not hesitate to tacitly cooperate with the United States when the conditions are favorable to it. Consequently, the rhetoric of unlimited friendship with Russia in world affairs can be really summed up as friendship as long as it benefits China. Though he sees Russia as not the main global danger, Xi Jinping finds it helpful since it helps him to control his economic and energy weaknesses. Beijing, on the other hand, depends on Western technological businesses and financial markets. Thus, it does not want to cut global trade relations with the United States. Xi's attempt to maintain Russia in the center and flexible without totally losing it to the West, but without totally clashing with it either, is hence the Shandong port ban. Putin is somewhat afraid of this since China, on which he mostly hopes, can compromise Russian oil ship trade if needed. Though theoretically the Kremlin may respond, practically it has no tools left to face China. Cut off from the West, Russia depends on Beijing as its sole economic lifeline. Beijing is exploiting this predicament into its own geopolitical advantage. The announcement that China has struck a blow to Putin's shadow fleet might thereby undermine Russia's standing in world oil markets even more. The arbitrary actions of Shanghai or Shandong port could compromise the Kremlin's plan of frightening the West with nuclear weapons or massive energy trump cards. Russia's war economy would come to a stop if it failed to sell oil, so Putin's expansionist aspirations in Ukraine would be unsustainable. Now fast spinning in Beijing's direction are the wheels of the Russian economy. Under such a reliance, Xi Jinping can control unlimited friendship with Russia, even making subdued gestures to the US by weakening its shadow fleet if needed. Putin has decided to be silent for the time being since Russia's domestic refineries and exporters would be forced into bankruptcy should the Shandong port ban become a more severe one. Ultimately, the knowledge that the Kremlin leader's biggest economic trump card could turn against him exposes just how precarious Russia-China ties truly are in the new age. Thank you for following us.